Chicago in February 1929 smelled of coal smoke, whiskey, and the brittle cold that makes breath hang like a promise. The city was a map of turf lines and telephone wires, speakeasies and storefronts, brutes in fancy suits, and men who could take your life with the same efficiency they took an order at a bar. For a decade, Prohibition had rerouted American appetites underground. Fortunes rose and fell on casks of illegal liquor, and between the bootleggers there was a violence as regular as the postman's rounds. The war between the north side and the south side of the city had been simmering, but on February 14, 1929, it boiled over into an act of such cold, methodical savagery that the country recoiled. 7 men lay dead on a garage floor, their faces turned toward a bare brick wall, their bodies still warm in the single naked bulb's weak light. It was a massacre dressed as execution. They called it the St. Valentine's Day Massacre almost immediately, a name the papers loved for its irony. It wasn't a love affair gone bad. It was calculated territory clearing. The target was George "Bugs" Moran, head of the North Side Gang, a wiry, flinty Irish-American who'd fought his way up through the city's underworld and refused to bow to the growing power of Al Capone and the Chicago outfit. Moran's men kept a garage at 2122 North Clark Street, where they stored cars, made deals, and sometimes waited out the winter. On that Thursday, the garage became a stage. It began with a ruse. 4 men in police uniforms, coats, caps, the kind that made people obey without a second thought, pulled up outside the SMC Cartage Company garage just after 10:30 a.m. The sight of police drew attention, as it always did. A car ride away, inside, Moran's gang members were going about their business, counting money, nursing hangovers, moving crates. One of the crew, Albert Weinshank, owned an adjacent saloon and would later be mistaken for Moran himself. The armed faux officers strode up, flashed badges, and demanded everyone line up against the wall. They chewed the pretense like a bad script. "We have a warrant." They made it sound official. Men raised their hands and faced the brick. The ruse was perfect because it took advantage of ordinary obedience. Ordinary people trusted a uniform. Once the victims were in position, 2 other men waited in the garage's doorway, and another car idled in the street. Then, with the organization of a military ambush, the killers opened up. Tommy guns chattered like a monstrous insect. Shotguns barked, pistols cracked. 60, 70 rounds ripped through flesh and bone at a distance of only a few yards. The men were ordered to raise their hands. They were shot in the head, in the chest, from both standing and kneeling positions. Several fell instantly. Some slumped and tried to crawl. One, Frank Gusenberg, bled for hours. He was found with a lit cigarette in his mouth and 14 bullet wounds in his body. When officers asked who shot him, he refused to speak. He was taken to the hospital and died without naming his killers. His silence was the final stubborn punctuation of that morning. There were 7 dead by the time the shooters melted back into Chicago's alleys. George "Bugs" Moran's men and associates, a mixture of gunners and hangers-on who, in the chaotic calculus of crime, had to be eliminated if Moran himself could not be found. The bodies were arranged in a grim line, some with their coats draped over the faces. The blood puddled, then froze into a sheet of horror that newspapers framed and reprinted. A lone light bulb hung from the ceiling, and photographs show men in coats and hats peering down at the sprawled corpses, as if the town had been made raw with the bright, unforgiving truth. No one was arrested that day. No one ever was successfully prosecuted for it. The public's gaze turned quickly and naturally toward Alphonse Al Capone, the kingpin of Chicago's South Side outfit. Capone had been engaged in a long, bitter business war with Moran over whiskey lanes and distribution rights. Moran's operation had repeatedly sniped Torrio and later Capone's interests. Killings and counter-killings had been a familiar currency. Capone offered motive in abundance. He wanted Moran exterminated, or at least neutered. But Capone's advantage was as much strategic as it was criminal. By 1929, he had friends inside politics and police, and he kept himself in sight but out of reach. When the massacre happened, Capone was in Miami, several states away, a fact he would point to whenever accusations swirled. He could, however, order a hit without ever setting foot near the crime. That was the cruel genius of kingdom building in the age of Prohibition. Despite suspicion, nobody could tie Capone to the wheel of those Tommy guns with court-proof evidence. The method was brutally plain: deception, speed, and firepower. The killers used Thompson submachine guns, Tommy guns, and shotguns, the cutting-edge murder tools of their time. The combination turned a small brick garage into a slaughterhouse. Investigators found .45 caliber pieces and shells consistent with such weapons. The choice of armament suggested organization. Thompsons were costly and sonic. They made a statement. It wasn't a street brawl. It was an execution choreographed for effect and efficiency. Those who pulled triggers that morning intended to send a message none could ignore. The North Side or the South Side would not be trifled with. If the killers had expected a simple job and quick glory, the aftermath complicated their plans in ways they might not have anticipated. The bodies were found by a truck driver and a policeman who responded to reports of shots. The city police swarmed the scene. Witnesses, frightened and selective, gave pieces of an account. Men in police uniforms, a car idling, a garage turned tomb. The newspapers feasted. Chicago's already loud press corps turned the massacre into a front-page drama. Editorials called for federal action. The public wanted blood, but the underworld was better at silence. No witnesses would come forward with the one name that mattered. Fear, loyalty, and a culture of murder kept tongues sealed. The investigation had clues, but no binding thread. Police recovered the burned-out remains of a Cadillac, soon after a car that, when dismantled and set ablaze, suggested an attempt to erase tracks. Inside the scorched vehicle they found a siren and pieces of clothing, and evidence that someone had tried to make the car look like a patrol vehicle. It was a clumsy cover that nonetheless revealed premeditation. The garage owner's notebook turned up with some odd notations. Slugs that matched recovered weapons were cataloged. A few names surfaced in witness statements, and later, FBI memoranda. Fred "Killer" Burke, a ruthlessly efficient gunman said to have come up from St. Louis. Jack McGurn, the Italian-born capo later dubbed Machine Gun McGurn, and linked closely to Capone. Gus Winkler, Fred Goods, and others, men with histories of violence and expertise in the business of killing. Later investigators and prosecutors would argue until their voices were hoarse, and historians would spend decades unraveling threads. But in court, the story never held together enough to convict. There are small, stubborn artifacts from that morning which linger as testimony. One is Frank Gusenberg's refusal to talk, the most glaringly defiant gesture in the whole affair. Found bleeding and conscious, Gusenberg was interrogated in the hospital. He breathed, he cursed, he curled his hand around a cigarette, and when asked who fired, he said nothing meaningful. He almost seemed to cling to the underworld's code. Even on death's threshold, naming names was betrayal. That silence was both a moral and legal stone in the prosecutor's path. Without a dying declaration, without an eyewitness willing to finger the shooters, the case recoiled into rumor and suspicion. Another artifact was the burned Cadillac found days later. Someone had purchased and disassembled it, removed its engine and seats, and set fire to the carcass, but not before leaving behind telltale scraps. Papers, a siren, a Luger items that suggested both planning and haste. That car was a trail that, for a while, gave investigators hope they could chase fingerprints or connect dots to a buyer, but the trail ran cold. At the time, police work in such matters was organized but porous. Witness intimidation and corruption made prosecutions rare in high-profile mob cases. In the weeks and months that followed, arrests were made, but convictions were not. Several men, including McGurn and others tied to Capone, were detained or questioned. McGurn, famously, had a powerful alibi. The singer and girlfriend who provided corroboration and who would be called the Blonde Alibi. Another suspect, Burke, had links to a St. Louis outfit known as Egan's Rats and was, by many accounts, a professional killer, for hire the kind of man Capone might employ because he was not from the city. He couldn't be recognized by Moran's men. Confessions and recollections later, like the story told by a man named Byron Bolton, or the testimonies found in FBI memos, fingered a list of shooters. But law enforcement of the era was hampered by local corruption, interdepartmental squabbling, and the sheer web of fear the mob had spun. The evidence that did exist rarely survived the courtroom's demand for certainty. Capone's fingerprints were never found on the operation, though the drumbeat of suspicion followed him for the rest of his life. The massacre was widely ascribed to him by the press and by Moran himself, who publicly blamed Capone and swore revenge. Capone's men, those investigators named with varying degrees of certainty, included individuals who would either die violently in later years or disappear into the organized crime landscape. Yet Capone himself would not be brought to justice for murder. Instead, federal authorities would bring him down on tax evasion years later, the classical example of dipping beneath a criminal's glamour and illustrating how economic crimes can be far easier to prosecute than ones rooted in fear and silence. There's a cruelty in the detail of how the killers exploited ordinary trust. People obey uniforms. They obey badges. That small human thing, the instinct to trust a policeman, became as a weapon. The garbled theater was deliberate. Send men in police garb, make the victims comply, and then erase the evidence with a furious spray of automatic fire. The killers knew the psychology of compliance and used it to devastating effect. For a city used to gangland bravado, this morning was something else. It was strategic terror. The massacre did something to Chicago's aura. For a moment, the public's stomach lurched. The spectacle of bodies lined like fallen statues under a single bulb was a grotesque image that newspapers printed in full. Photographs of the scene men in hats looking down, crowds pressed into the street traveled across the country, a reminder that the county line between civic order and lawlessness was porous. Editors demanded federal action. Politicians performed outrage. The city's surface gloss of prosperity and jazz-age gaiety showed a darker scene beneath. The event became a turning point not because it ended mob power, but because it forced national attention on the business of organized crime and eventually helped galvanize legislative and law enforcement shifts that would constrain the gangsters' public reach. As with many great crimes, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre invites rumor and theory like a magnet attracts iron filings. Some historians argue the hit was a Capone job, arranged through intermediaries. Others insist it was the act of competitors or rogue killers with private grudges. Some suspect one man. Others say too many names are floated for any single plot to be believable. What remains constant is the basic outline: a brutal ambush, the use of mimicry, police uniforms, an armory of automatic weapons, a burned getaway car, and an absence of courtroom justice. When the dust settled, the city had 7 fewer men, a string of frightened associates, and a press eager to claim the story as emblematic of the era's moral rot. The men who died were ordinary in the business's terms: foot soldiers, chauffeurs, and lieutenants who had lived by the street's violent code. Their funerals were small and secretive, a last nod in a world where public mourning could be dangerous. Bugs Moran survived. He had been away that day, but his power waned. His gang never fully recovered from the psychological shock and practical loss inflicted on that morning. Capone's empire, for a time, seemed untouchable. Yet the massacre also hardened its enemies and spread the roots of law enforcement's resolve. In the long run, the headlines and the outrage helped shape a political will that would, in the 1930s, dismantle parts of Prohibition and refocus national attention on law enforcement reforms. History keeps reaching back to pull the massacre apart, to name faces, to track cars, to read FBI memos and parole papers. But a clean verdict never comes. There are fragments, witness accounts that contradict each other, notes about phone calls that were never traced, and a scattered register of petty crimes tied to suspects, But the essential question remains as blunt as the day after the shooting. Who ordered the hit, and who pulled the triggers? We have likely answers, probabilities gathered from documents and confessions made when men had nothing left to lose. But in a court of law, those probabilities did not add up. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre closed its ears to justice and left a ringing silence in its place. If you stand on Clark Street now, the city has changed utterly. The brick facade where men died is a parking lot. The snow melts into storm drains, and the roar of the 1920s has become an echo in the museum plaques and the occasional true crime podcast. The massacre's image men stacked against a brick wall. Death, like a shuttered camera, endures because it crystallizes the moment when America watched its own urban modernity show a naked, organized face. It's a story about power and cunning, about how easily ordinary respect for authority can be bent into an instrument of murder, and about how the law sometimes arrives too late, with evidence rinsed away by fear. The killers left no signed confession on the garage floor. They left bullets and burnt metal, and the shape of a plan that was both primitive and ruthless. The men who organized the hit, whether a boss far away giving orders through intermediaries, or a coalition of killers for hire, achieved their aim that day. They terrorized a city, gored a rival, and advanced an empire that would eventually be taken down, not by vengeance, but by accounting. The massacre remains one of the most vivid, if unresolved, events of the Prohibition era, a brutal demonstration of the human capacity for organized violence, staged with a terrible, almost theatrical precision. If you want a single fact to remember from that morning, it is not the names of those who might have ordered it. It is the picture of a single bulb swinging in a garage, the light casting shadows across men who had trusted a uniform and were paying with their lungs and blood. That image, spare, clean, unforgiving, is why the tale of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre still stops readers cold, almost 100 years later.